Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. Today, I have with me Claiborne Deming, who is truly an expert on energy policy. You're going to see today he's thought a lot about this and done a lot of research. We're going to be presenting a lot of graphs and data and logic. This is a very clear-headed, practical approach to dealing with climate change and energy problems that we face in the future. I think you're really going to enjoy this. If you're involved in investing, if you're involved in policy, if you are involved in just running a business, these are things you need to be familiar with. And for some reason, although all of this is publicly available, it doesn't seem to be brought together in a very coherent way that Claiborne has brought it together. And furthermore, you don't hear experts talking about it. So in this podcast recording, you're going to understand what is driving us to not make optimal decisions. What are the things driving us to not do that? And also, what is the current situation? And what should we do going forward? You're going to hear Claiborne explain that to us. He was president and chief executive officer of Murphy Oil from 1994 to 2008. Since 2008, he served as chairman of Murphy Oil. He has participated in he served as chairman of the National Petroleum Council, and he served as president of the 25-year club of the petroleum industry, and served on the board of directors of Entergy from 2002 to 2006. But he's been very interested in energy policy for many years, and I think that'll really come clear as you listen to this podcast. Enjoy. Claiborne, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. I'm delighted to be here. This topic, which I've called the Energy Transition Challenge, really fascinates me.
Me too, and I think it's so important for leaders of major companies, policymakers, et cetera. People need to be aware of this.
I agree, and I can just jump right in.
Please do.
And the challenge of alternatives is also a dilemma. There's a big dilemma out there that we're facing in the energy world. And so let me frame it this way. Most climate experts believe fossil fuel use is the primary cause of climate change. By the way, I'm in that camp. But fossil fuel use will very likely remain the world's primary energy source for many more decades. So that's the dilemma. We're hooked on fossil fuels. We're going to use them into the future, and I'll show you why and how it's almost inevitable. But it's very likely it impacts the climate. But at the very end of my presentation, I'm going to show you there's a realistic path forward.
That's good to know. Otherwise, all we're going to hear is bad news.
No, and there is certainly a lot of facts that people need to know in this presentation. Right. And I think current policy choices by policymakers are ineffective, and I'll show you, I think, pretty clearly why they are. But I think there's another path forward that makes sense for us.
Good news. So now we're looking at this slide of climate change. It's over time, and it's looking at temperature changes over time from 1880 to 2020. So would you explain this to us?
Sure. It starts at pre-industrial times, 1880, and it tracks temperature. It's NASA data. Of course, NASA wasn't formed until the 60s, so it's NASA data starting then. And it shows, starting in the early 60s, a pretty pronounced increase in surface temperatures, and it's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit over, say, 1940 or 1950 setting. And I think it's coincident with the increased burning of fossil fuels as the U.S. has become wealthier and more industrialized, and then especially as the East, the rise of Asia has become more industrialized. And so I put it in here to say, I think these are the facts, and I think we have to grapple with them.
So why can't we just stop?
Such a great question, because if we think we have a problem, why can't we just stop the behavior which likely causes it? And I think there's three reasons, and then the three reasons cause an ineffective policy response. The first is behavioral barriers, and I'm going to explain that more in a minute. The second is it's a transnational phenomenon, so it's not just the U.S. that's causing this issue. And then I don't think alternatives, primarily wind and solar, are yet realistic replacements at scale. And so those three reasons, I think, mean that our current and discussed policy responses are ineffective. I don't think they solve the problem.
So this next slide looks at this delayed payoff problem. And for those, you'll be seeing this slide, and it shows the horizontal axis is 2010 to 2060, and the vertical axis is surface temperature change. And so the solid lines that you see are you can see it's like RCP 8.5. That stands for Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5. It's a scenario that represents high emission future with increasing greenhouse gas emission over time, leading to high atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And you'll see the squiggly lines around it represent scenarios that could occur, so like simulated scenarios. But you can see that once you get to 2060, they're distinct. So, the path, the purple line path, is very different than the yellow line path. So could you explain this to us?
So in this particular case, you start mitigation efforts in the year 2010. So you're emitting less CO2, less methane into the atmosphere, less greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. You have to go 25 years before you see some difference in these three paths, different temperature paths. But they're still within the noise of the data. So you don't know if it's natural variability or whether it's the mitigation efforts that you started 25 years before. If you go another 10 years to 2045, you start thinking, yeah, there are real differences here between these three paths. My mitigation efforts have been successful, but still arguably it's within the noise of the data. You have to go to 2060, 50 years after you started the mitigation efforts, before you can clearly say, absolutely, my mitigation efforts were successful. So the point is this: who's going to make a decision in 2010 that they're not going to see the impacts of until 2035, 25 years later, much less 35 years later, much less 50 years later. So it's very difficult for human beings to make choices now that don't have an impact.
This gets back to the behavioral.
It is. It's one of the behavioral issues which precludes us from making decisions to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. You want to see an impact in your lifetime. I mean, you want to see an impact immediately, of course. You'd like to see it in 3 years, 5 years, but it's difficult to do something you don't see any impact for a minimum 25 years. And there's a first cousin to this one, Matt, and that is individual behaviors don't have an impact either. So I've often wondered why high profiles, self-described climate activists, climate warriors, especially the wealthy ones, fly in private planes. Why do they have more than one house? Why do they have 2 or 3 houses? Now, they're not bad people, and they're smart people too, by the way. So why do they make these decisions? Because people can obviously see their behaviors and criticize them for it. But they justify it because they know if they stop their behavior, it won't solve the problem. It won't impact the problem one iota. And so this is another behavioral, really powerful reason why it's difficult for us to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. Delayed response is one of impact, and also individual behaviors don't have an impact.
This reminds me of the voter's paradox. And the voter's paradox says, the probability of any one vote changing an election is close to zero, very close to zero. And so you could say it's not optimal for anyone to do it, to vote, but people do it for virtue signaling and because they think it's a good thing to do. But in reality, it's a similar kind of a problem.
Absolutely, and people don't understand this really kind of writ large, but it's something that we all face as human beings when we make choices every day.
Absolutely. This next slide, energy access and use is fundamental to progress. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this is also really important. The vertical axis is GDP per capita. This is all 2021 data in U.S. dollars. And then the horizontal axis is annual energy use per person. That's in barrels of oil. Then we have nations in there. So they're plotted against these two.
Are the size of those circles like their population?
Yeah, good point. The U.S. obviously is high and to the right. We're very wealthy, close to $70,000 a year per capita GDP. We consume close to 50 barrels a day, 50 barrels a year in oil. 50 barrels a year in oil. And our population is 330 million. That's the size of that bubble. Then if you go down to the left, people who are less wealthy and who consume less oil, you have China. They're 1.3 billion people. You have India, 1.3 billion people. You got Africa, 1.3 billion people. You got Central and South America, about 700 million people. And they're quite poor, and they consume very little energy. All of them want to be like us. And the only way they can be like us or be like the Western world, Western Europe, is have access to affordable energy. And right now, the only affordable, scaled-up energy source are fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. Wind and solar haven't yet gotten to the point where they can scale and where they're affordable. So very, very likely, these billions of people down here in the lower part of the graph that are poor and don't consume much energy are going to consume more energy in the future as they're aspirationally try to join the middle class. And it's almost inevitable. I don't see how this doesn't happen, quite frankly. And I've got a great example to show you how it's happened recently.
So this next graph is titled Countries with Middle Class Ambitions Will Want More. Can you explain this?
Yeah. So it's the horizontal graph is over time, starting in 1965. It goes to 2020. And the vertical graph is millions of barrels a day of oil consumption. And so I've got 4 different blocks on here, for lack of a better word. One is China. One is select Southeast Asia, which is Asia outside of China. One is Africa, and one is India. And by the way, each has 1.3 billion people. And so Deng Xiaoping in the 80s in China became the premier, and he made policy decisions to unleash their economy. He saw how it worked, and he implemented them, and it did work. So China's energy consumption stunningly went from 2 million barrels a day. Now it's close to 16 million barrels a day. So it was an 8-fold increase. So it shows you when you become wealthier, when you become more powerful, which everyone wants to happen in their societies, you consume more energy. Almost inevitably in today's world, that's oil and gas, because it's affordable, it's fungible, it's transportable, it's got extraordinarily high energy density. That's what you use. So this is the dilemma. We're likely as a world, we're going to use more and more fossil fuels over time as these billions of people in Africa and Asia become wealthier.
So we've been focusing on the behavioral barriers, but there's also a global problem here. And, a number of treaties have been worked out between countries. Have they worked?
Interestingly, you'd think, since it's transnational and it's a problem, let's get together and let's solve it. But the data reflects that treaties don't work. And I'll quickly go over this. So the UN formed a framework convention on climate change, and that's still the body in place today. It was created in 1992, and they created a 1990 baseline. They looked back and they said, okay, global CO2 emissions were 20,500 metric tons in 1990. They set their first set of limits on CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in 1997 at Kyoto. But by 2000, world emissions were 23,000 metric tons. So they were up about, 15% in 10 years. The next big meeting was 2015, and it was touted as a big breakthrough. But by then, global emissions were at 32,000 metric tons. So they had increased by 50% in 15 years, a dramatic increase. And I showed you the reason why it is China. They became wealthy. They consumed a lot more energy, and other Asians did as well. But the Paris Accords were voluntary. They built in some emissions growth. The pledges they made weren't met, and the world exceeded the estimate that they said of CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in 2040. We exceeded that estimate by 2021, only 6 years after Paris. And that we now emit 36,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases, man-made greenhouse gases. So ultimately, emissions have grown by 79% compared to the 1990 baseline. So these countries meet, these policy makers meet, and they set goals, but they're never made. They're never met. And there's a simple reason. Nation states always prioritize self-interest. They're in competition with other nation states. They realize if their poor don't become middle class, they'll be voted out of office or worse, overthrown. So they're desperate to make sure that their nations grow as fast and as quickly as possible. Only way to do that is through fossil fuel use right now. And so these treaties don't work because nation states or policy makers say one thing at the conventions or the treaties and then do another.
Well, this next slide titled Transnational Problem, it's a really interesting slide from 1990 to 2001, and you can see rest of world, India, China, U.S. One thing I want to point out is after 2021, and Claiborne explained this to me, that's if these stay within the stated policies. So you see at the top that dark line, and it says stated policies. That's if it stays within the stated policy.
Matt, good point, because we had these stated policies before 2021, and we said one thing, but we did another, and obviously CO2 emissions grew. This slide's important, and it's got a couple of important points to be made from it. You look at 1990, when the 20,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions were mentioned in the prior slide, reflects that. The U.S. was a quarter of the world's emissions. So fast forward to 2021, we're at 36,000 metric tons. We've actually decreased our CO2 emissions. The rest of the world's grown, and we're less than 15% of the world's CO2 emissions. And so to use an overused metaphor, we don't drive the bus anymore. Anything we do in our country really doesn't matter because any mitigation efforts that we make, takes us a long time to implement them, by the way, are overwhelmed by the growth in the rest of the world. That's what this slide reflects.
Well, even the fact that the U.S. has gone down over that time, it is impressive when you think about it.
It's stunning, actually, and the peak for the U.S. was 2008. When we had the Great Recession, obviously industrial activity stopped or slowed. But then when we came back slower with CO2 emissions than we ever had before, and there's a reason for it. One, we substituted natural gas for coal and power generation. It's an amazingly powerful way to reduce your CO2 emissions. Secondly, we made our more efficient, our energy use more efficient. Wealthy countries can do it, and we did it. And third, there's some alternatives in here. So on the margin, alternatives can make a difference. Those are the three reasons, but about in that order of how we diminished our CO2 or lessened our CO2 emissions, but we grew our economy by 25%.
That is remarkable.
It's remarkable. It shows the entrepreneurship and ingenuity of.
It does. I want to point out an anecdote that I've mentioned to you before that I learned from Craig Harper. And basically, if you look at emissions of heavy-duty Class A trucks, so semi-tractor trailers, it takes 60 trucks today with brand new tractors, 60 to have the same amount of emissions as one truck had in 1980. So 60 to 1. And the remarkable thing about that is that's over a 44-year period. So to your point about ingenuity and entrepreneurship, this is remarkable.
And no, it makes a stunning difference. Absolutely. So
now looking at alternatives that are not yet realistic replacements, we've got this graph that says the difficulties of displacing fossil fuels. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I can. So first, the first point is there's three reasons why it's difficult to displace fossil fuels. The first is energy density, which is chart to the right, I'll explain in a minute, is one of the reasons. The second is the location of wind and solar, the two major alternatives, are in the wrong spots where the people aren't. And then third, there's an intermittency issue with wind and solar, which makes it really difficult. But we'll start with energy density. So vertical axis is energy per unit of weight. So in any given kilogram or pound, how much BTUs are in it. And then the horizontal axis is energy use, energy per unit of volume, so in an area of space. So you want to be high and to the right, which means you're both have a lot of BTUs in any particular volume or weight. And what's up there? It's gasoline, it's diesel, it's heating oil, it's jet fuel. Coal's up there, even though it's not as good as natural gas or oil. And what's way down to the left and to the bottom? It's lead-acid batteries and even lithium-ion batteries. And the example that I think that captures it most is if you fill up your car with gasoline, that tank weighs 80 to 100 pounds. But if you have a fully electrified vehicle, the battery pack weighs at a minimum 1,000 pounds and probably up to 2,000 pounds if you have a lot of range. And so it just doesn't have the energy density. It doesn't mean that you can't use it. It's just it's much, much, much less efficient in its use. In the space of a battery, you have just much more energy use if that space is occupied by oil. It's just freakishly high. Nature provided that to us, and that's why we massively adopted it. So that's really a big obstacle, which is just the physics of the composition of the energy. And that's what this slide shows. The next two I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this slide were location and intermittence.
Yeah, this slide is called location, lack of wind in population and growth centers. So the dark red means lots of wind. The light blue means very little wind. So how do we interpret this?
So this is just global wind data that, of course, they've calculated over years. And what it shows you is that the most intense winds are on the coastlines. And they're typically in the northern hemispheres. And so wind can have its place, especially if there's a population center on a coastline in the northern hemisphere. But the issue that we face today, and this is a global issue in the U.S., is not the problem, not the center of the problem, is we have India, we have China, we have Asia outside of China, we have Africa, and they just don't have the wind resources. Typically, you need to scale up and provide wind as an alternative to fossil fuels. It's just a fact. So it's got its spots, but it's just not in the right places where the people are.
Interesting. And so the next slide is also a location slide. It says lack of solar in population and growth centers.
So solar's better, and it shows we have a lot of solar in the western U.S. We've got it in certain parts of Africa, certainly in Australia. But look where we don't have it. We don't have it in China, except in Western China. There's no people in Western China. We don't have it in India, and we don't have it in Asia outside of China. And so these massive population areas that are industrious and working hard and going to consume more energy and have and will in the future, they just don't have access to solar resources as much as they should. Doesn't mean it won't be used, but I believe it's best used on the margin, and I doubt that it's going to be used as a primary source of energy in those jurisdictions. So Matt, let's talk about intermittency first, because this is really the largest and biggest issue to overcome by renewables. So imagine electricity demand. There's some variations in it. You have a peak demand and then you have a base load, but the variation's only about 20 to 25%. And that's because industrial use is about 35 to 40% of all electricity use, and it's 24/7. And think of big office buildings and stores that have to be heated and cooled 24/7. It's not realistic not to do it that way. So there's a big baseload demand. So you've got this demand which has got to be met. Then you have the power supply, which is intermittent. And so how do you square that circle? When the power supply is intermittent and the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, you have to have a full thermal backup ready to supplant the wind and solar when they're not generating. And that's expensive. So you're running two systems basically the whole time that you have an intermittent sources of energy. And the second piece is the only way out of that, to have these two big systems, is to have some type of grid-level battery storage. So when you are generating with wind and solar, you're not only generating to meet current demand, but you're generating to store for the future when wind and solar are not generating, not producing. And the problem in today's world is we don't have the technology for grid-level battery storage. Lithium-ion batteries are very good, but they don't have the energy density yet on scale to replace a full national grid system if it goes down. So you still have to maintain the system of a full 24/7 backup to meet these issues when these intermittents aren't producing. And so it becomes really expensive, and that's why jurisdictions with intermittent power typically have much higher energy costs than those that don't. Think California, think Western Europe, specifically Germany. Now let's go to this slide, because this slide is really interesting. It shows you electricity demand over a 300-hour period. That's the horizontal axis, and that's about 12 and a half days. And then it shows you with a 40% peak demand supplied by renewables, how they go up and down.
So the brown line's the renewable production.
That's correct.
And the dark line is the demand.
That's correct. And so it shows kind of the fluctuations, because there is some fluctuation. Basically, it's a big base load. And so renewables can provide all of it sometimes, but typically not. Sometimes they hardly generate at all. So this just reflects you need that 24/7 backup or grid-level battery storage, which doesn't exist. But look at the 80% of peak demand, because that's really the most interesting one of all. And again, think about it. The black line is the base load demand. And then if the brown line is if 80% of the demand is met by intermittents or renewables. And so what happens is, because you're dormant when you're so much of the time when you're generating from intermittents, when you are generating to meet this 80% goal, you have to generate way too much. And so there's horrible waste or excessive waste when you come to generating from renewables, if you have a really high percentage of the total base load that you're trying to meet. And that's another reason why they're so expensive. So the only way out of this dilemma is really to literally have grid-level battery storage, because you're way overproducing, so you need to use that energy and store it when you're not producing, but again, we don't have it. So intermittents have so many obstacles to overcome. It's just baseload demand needs a X number, but the supply is bouncing up and down. And it's really hard to overcome, and it's extremely expensive.
And, it doesn't even to have these batteries, the batteries themselves take a lot of energy to create, and then they produce a lot of waste that's not so good for the environment.
I agree with you. And there's another interesting point to make, and I think this is really important for people to understand. And that is, you often hear that wind and solar are now cost comparable to other thermal generation. And that is because they only look at the cost of manufacturing the wind turbine or the solar panel and the installation cost. But there's three costs which they don't include. They don't include the cost of the backup thermal storage thermal generation capacity that you have to have. It's 24/7. It has to be there if we're going to meet demand when the intermittents aren't producing. Secondly, they don't include the cost of any battery storage, which people want to have. At some point, if we continue down this policy path, we'll have some stab at it, and it's going to be extremely expensive. That number is not included. A third number is you have to massively upgrade the grid. And we'll look at a slide in a minute. If you're going to electrify everything, that cost isn't included. And so they make that claim, and it's true if you just look at a small piece of the cost of electricity generation. But there's three big pieces that they don't include. And if you're a utility, you have those costs, and you will have to pass them on to your rate base, or you're a consumer. You go bankrupt.
So this next slide, building on this, is location and transmission, another infeasible stretch. It's interesting because the horizontal axis, of course, is time, and gigawatt miles is the vertical axis. But the U.S. Department of Energy collected data for a time, and they quit collecting it, and now UT Austin has collected it for a time. There's no clear plan for the future, which is a little scary.
Well, this is done in the context of showing how net zero, which you often hear, is a really impractical thought. And and people need to understand that it's so highly unlikely to reach a net zero scenario that it's almost silly to be talking about it. And we can make bad policy decisions if we try to achieve net zero. So this shows the gradual increase in gigawatt miles over time. You have to do it. Society gets wealthier, society grows, population grows, so the grid grows. And it grows steadily, incrementally but steadily. And then it shows you where the grid would have to be in 2050, and this is Princeton University, and they're really quite good at this. They have a very accomplished policy shop. Shows you how many gigawatt miles have to be added to the grid to get there. And anybody can see that's not going to happen. It's infeasible. And so that's the point that I'm trying to make here. It just likely won't happen to meet a net zero target in the U.S.
And one other point I'd like to make is that 60% of our grid is past its 50-year life expectancy.
Yeah.
This is another problem.
It's a significant problem, and as we've discussed, there's an explosion now in energy use. And that's because of AI, which consumes an extraordinary amount of energy due to the computing power. You have cloud computing centers, you have crypto mining. Unexpectedly, there's a surge in energy demand, right when we least need it if we're going to meet these goals.
Yeah. So this next slide talks about world fuel demand is likely persistent even as renewables surge. Could you explain that?
Yeah, this is IEA data. It's a Paris-based inter-policy group funded by the West, which is really capable people and have access to a lot of data. And so it looks at 2021 and it says, hey, look, 79% of all the energy generated in 2021 were fossil fuels. This is a fact. These are data. Then they make projections into the future, and I've selected 2050, which is when the net zero goal is supposed to be achieved. And it says, okay, if we look at steps, this is the one we talked about earlier. They're calling policy settings. It's what if governments do what they say they're going to do. And by the way, they haven't. But if they do what they say they're going to do on these policy goals in energy, then energy use will increase over time, which I think is a reasonable assumption. And the amount of oil and gas is reduced as a percentage from 79% in 2021 to 62% in 2050. But because the pie's grown, then the 62% is about equal to the 79%. And it shows the difference, obviously, is going to be renewables. So look at the next one, which is called announced pledges scenario. These are aspirational targets set by governments. You actually show a decrease in energy use. Now, look, the only time we've had a decrease in energy use was the COVID shutdown, and it was very temporary, and we rebounded quite quickly. And for us to have a decrease in energy use voluntarily as a society worldwide is extraordinarily unlikely. So I almost dismissed the APS. And then you look at net zero, it shows even a greater decrease in energy use. As I showed you earlier, aspirational nations, billions of people, hardworking people, aren't going to accept that. So these latter two, I think, are unrealistic policy settings, but they're there because they've been asked by policymakers to make those make those projections. Anyway, the takeaway is fossil fuel use is likely going to stay robust into the future.
And this next slide, titled Persistent Coal.
Yeah, and this is actually very important. And this is almost an asterisk to the prior slide. It shows China, India, rest of Asia Pacific, and the rest of the world. And it shows you coal consumption. And look at the spike starting in 2000. That's when the policies that Deng Xiaoping put into place really took hold. And so oil and gas use surged, and so did coal use surged in China. And so look at this stat. The share of the world's CO2 emissions from energy, world coal is 40% of that. Now, CO2 emissions from energy, it's kind of a hard number to find, but it's somewhere 75 to 80%. So 40% of that 80% comes from coal. And then China alone is 21% of that.
So half of the coal.
Yes.
Wow.
And look at the next stat. Currently, there's 258 coal-fired power stations, either proposed, permitted, or under construction in China alone. Look at the next one. India expects its power plants to burn about 8% more coal in the financial year ending March 2024. And so you hear about China adopting all these renewables and being a powerhouse in solar panel production. But look at what they do. They burn coal. They burn a heck of a lot of coal. And a shorthand way to look at climate change and impacts and what can make a difference is it's a China coal problem. That's where all the incremental CO2 comes, and soon to be an India coal problem. Because as they get wealthier, that's how they're going to have to provide power to their people, almost inevitably, because of the limitations of the intermittent sources of renewable sources. Really important to understand this. And we can't stop them, Matt. They're going to do this. Because they want to keep their jobs.
And they don't have as much natural gas.
They don't. And they don't have much oil either. They had one large field in the northern part of the country, which has largely been depleted, and they don't have natural gas reserves, significant natural, but they have massive coal reserves.
But the U.S.'s contribution to CO2 emissions from coal is minuscule now, but it's going to get even smaller over time.
As I mentioned before, that's how we've grown as a society, but we've lessened our CO2 emissions. We've substituted natural gas for coal and power generation. That's a really big piece, single biggest piece of it. Now look at the next slide. This one's another one. It's a reality check. This shows you the age of global coal-fired capacity. Everyone says they're not going to build coal plants anymore because of the high concentration of CO2 emitted when you combust it. But look at this. 2/3 of all the coal plants are 20 years and younger. And so people are still building these left, right, and center. 2/3, maybe even a bit more, actually. So it's important to know these coal plants aren't going to be retired and aren't going away.
Obviously.
This highlights the dilemma that we're in as a world.
So you have made a strong case of this dilemma. What are some of the current and discussed policy responses?
Well, I think that's where the rubber meets the road. And so faced with all these facts, and I think they're all facts, I do, the U.S. has chosen to go down a path of saying we're going to subsidize wind and solar. And the point is this: renewable subsidies don't work even when they do, which is kind of a funny way to say it. But solar and wind supply is multiplied by sixfold from 2010 to 2021. And so all the subsidies, all the policies that we implemented actually did work. But fossil fuel percentage in the country's mix only dropped from 81% to 79%. And meanwhile, the pie grew so that 79% is bigger than the 81% was in 2010. So we as a country are consuming more oil and gas besides a sixfold increase.
And more efficiently.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we've grown and our CO2 emissions have diminished. And so a guy who's made this point repeatedly, who's really smart, is Holman Jenkins, who's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And he basically says, look, renewables subsidies don't work because all it does is encourage us to consume more of all energy. So, of course, we'll drive electric cars because they're subsidized, but we're not giving up our gasoline-powered cars. And so their policy responses just so far have been ineffective. They work, we have more of them, but we still consume more oil and gas. And so there's a disconnect here.
You know, something I want to interject another anecdote on transportation.
Sure.
And that is that, if we electrified the heavy-duty trucks today, it would increase the total demand on the grid by 10%. Okay? But it would cause a lot of other problems, too, because you would have to have more trucks on the road because they can't haul as much because they're heavier because of the batteries. They can't go as far. So in a given day, they can't haul as much freight. But if you, and in California, who's got lots of grid problems, they have a new policy that is requiring any incremental trucking into ports or rail yards to be renewable. So either battery electric or hydrogen fuel cells. And of course, now if you go further, and there's a policy being considered today on these things, if you include medium and light freight trucks, that's another, that goes from 10% to 40%. So all these trucks combined, it's actually 41% additional demand on the grid. And so, a lot of these policymakers aren't taking these things into account. But that doesn't even count cars.
Yeah.
Automobiles.
I know. It's just there's just a disconnect here. It's ineffective, and we don't have the money to build out the grid to meet it, for one thing, or the people to build the wires and install them.
Oh yeah. So this next one, this slide says net zero, unprecedented reduction in energy use. Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, so it's a point I made earlier, but this is really a better graphic way to describe it. You hear net zero as a goal by 2050. And it shows world energy use up until now. It grows every year. It has to grow. That's just the way the world works. It will work in the future. But to meet net zero, and this is a policy scenario set by the IEA again, smart people, looked at a lot of data, came up with this answer, show a decrease in energy use. And then half of the energy used is either wind and solar and other renewables. And I think I've already showed you, maybe not conclusively, I think the data is pretty conclusive, that it's hard to scale wind and solar. There's too many obstacles with it. And the other renewables, like is hydropower likely, perhaps, even though people don't want to dam up rivers anymore. And so I think it's unrealistic. I think when you hear net zero is our goal at a society-wide level, worldwide level, maybe individual companies can do it, but on a worldwide level, it's totally unrealistic. And if something's unrealistic, why do you talk about it? I think it misleads the public.
It does. So you've made a very strong case here. But now I'd love to know what are your recommendations? Given you've been thinking about this a long time, and this is well researched information, and I know you think about it all the time. You're very interested in policy, energy policy. So what are some things you're thinking about?
Well, Matt, this is again where the rubber meets the road, because you can highlight a problem, but the way I was trained, if you highlight a problem, you better come up with a way to solve the problem.
Yes.
And so I think it's got to be realistic, it's got to be implementable, it's got to be cost effective. And so this is how I would do it, and I think this is something that we ought to consider. First, wind and solar on the margin. A lot of it's installed, and if you generate it in a place where there's lots of wind and lots of solar, and as the technology improves, I think on the margin that can be a very helpful way to implement this policy. It's helped work in our country so far, by the way. It's one of the reasons why our CO2 emissions are down. And so I don't think it scales worldwide, but I do think that on the margin it can be helpful. The one which is easily the most immediately effective at scale is to substitute natural gas for coal and power generation. It's worked here in the U.S., and if you could accomplish that on a scaled worldwide basis, it would actually decrease CO2 emissions. So think about that. The economy doesn't shrink. You consume more energy, but you're producing less CO2. So shouldn't that be a policy objective that we don't achieve as a country? And look at the numbers. If done worldwide, you reduce about 18%. And that's, again, CO2 emissions from energy, and energy is about 75 or 80% of all CO2 emissions. And 9% if done by China alone. So you could reduce CO2 emissions with existing technology. There's plenty of natural gas in the world, the fracking of the world. The success of that has proven the point. We have just trillions of cubic feet of available reserves.
Now, to do it in China, wouldn't we need more facilities to make liquid LNG?
Yeah. Obviously, they import a lot of LNG, actually. They'd have to import a lot more.
So we'd have to have more ships for that?
Sure, absolutely. You'd have to, and we're building a lot of LNG export facilities in the U.S. We have to build more. And then other countries will too. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, they have massive gas reserves, especially in Qatar. And they liquefy it and they ship it around the world. You have to do more of it. Mozambique just made a huge offshore discovery. And it's luckily an American company is the lead operator in that project, and they're going to liquefy it. So it's not just the U.S., it's other naturally endowed countries. Australia is a big LNG producer. But that's something that just needs to...
Which country has the most natural gas?
Reserves, it may be the U.S., given fracking. But if you look at the Middle East, there are massive reserves. They're conventional, by the way, so they're a little bit easier to access, a little easier to scale. Qatar in particular has got such massive reserves, it's hard to even know what to do with them.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And for a long time, Israel didn't think they had it, and now they found it, right?
More than they can possibly consume. Egypt now is discovering natural gas offshore in the Mediterranean.
So natural gas is a real...
No, there's plenty of it, and you can't do 100% substitutions, sure, but you can start now, and you'll have an immediate impact on the issue that we're trying to address. So it's always perplexed me that climate activists, climate warriors don't want to do it because it's a fossil fuel, but it works, and it's effective, and it's proven, and it's inexpensive relative to alternatives. So it just seems like to me a natural. And so I would highly encourage folks to consider this. In fact, we won't solve our problem unless we do this. Now, the other one is increase of nuclear power. I'm going to say something really important. You can't say this enough. The only scalable carbon-free power source is nuclear power. The only scalable carbon-free power source is nuclear power. Say it 100 times, because it's true. The U.S. has got 93 active nuclear reactors. We used to have 100. We decommissioned them. We shouldn't decommission one. We should be building more. They scale. They provide wonderful, efficient energy use. The technology is understood. It's carbon-free. The first nuclear reactor in the U.S. was put in service in 1957. It's stunningly available, technologically understood, economically viable technology. And we just have developed a mindset that it's unsafe. And the primary reason is because you create nuclear waste when you split atoms, when you generate energy. And so right now they're stored on site at all these different plants. At one point, the DOE built a big repository in Nevada called Yucca Flats. But for political reasons, it was shut down after spending $10 billion. So at one point in our country, we had policies to increase the use of nuclear power and take care of the nuclear waste. But we don't now. And so the way that I frame it is that, yep, nuclear waste disposal is a problem. Very manageable right now. There's never been an issue with it. We have 93 active nuclear generating plants. And so we've solved it. There's better ways to do it if we put our mind to it. We've solved it. So you have to weigh that cost and that risk against climate impacts. And if you think climate impacts are existential, if you think the world's going to change, if you think that we're not going to be existent as a species in 150 years because of climate, then you have to weigh that cost against the cost of nuclear waste disposal. And it's a pretty easy policy decision to me. Of course you would deal with nuclear waste disposal. We have so far. And by the way, China's got, I think, 75 nuclear reactors. They want to build 150 more. So the world's building these things, and it's a great way. It's one of the essential ways to deal with climate. It scales. We understand the technology. So we're making a policy mistake, in my opinion, if we don't reinvest in the nuclear world.
That's great. So could you talk a little bit more about economics and policy, including carbon taxes?
I can. So those are substituting natural gas for coal and building more nuclear plants or things we can do right now. And they're industrial things. But we could also implement some policy. No one wants to hear this, but I'm going to say it. Climate is a classic economic externality. And externality in the world of economics is a cost which the market doesn't price. And we have no mechanism right now for pricing carbon. So there is a role for government. Government can put a price on it through taxes. If you tax something and make it a little bit more expensive, and I would do it low immediately and gradually increase it, then people will consume less hydrocarbons. So our current system is to subsidize the construction and consumption of renewables, but it hasn't retarded the use and consumption of hydrocarbons. So you have to put a tax on it if you want to slow that.
And that would also cause the substitution of natural gas for coal.
It would. It would, because you would tax it based upon the amount of carbon in the product. And so society's got to consider this. The world doesn't want to do it. Liberals don't want to do it because they're fearful they'll be voted out of office. Conservatives don't want to do it because it's against their ethic of higher taxes. But again, it's a classic externality. We think climate is a cost. The market is a pricing it. This is a way to price it. Now, I'd love a market system to price it, by the way. I think that'd be better. But so far, we haven't come up with one. And so there is a role here. And again, I do it small because you don't want to disrupt economies and then gradually increase it over time. I think that's important. You got to continue to heavily invest in technology. Now, we're investing a ton in battery technology and all sorts of technologies to reduce energy use, but also make it more efficient so we're not actually driving less. We need to continue that. So battery technology has got to be continued to be worked on really hard. There's an iteration after lithium ion. We got to find it. We got to find it really quickly. It's got to have more energy density. Yeah, and then lastly, I say you have to adapt to a slowly changing climate. We know, if we think we know this is going to happen, then you make changes. Human beings are adaptable, creative people. So you build things more resiliently. You build less on the coastline. You make choices as a society that adapt. Why? Because we're going to continue to use fossil fuels, as I've shown in, I think, my presentation, and renewables aren't yet ready. And we're not making these correct policy decisions on nuclear and natural gas. And so we need to adapt. So that's how I would look at it. That's how I would approach the problem. And I think it's affordable. I think the technology is there. And I would do these, I'd do them promptly. I'd do them right away. But I would also do all the research for other ways too, especially battery technology.
So Claiborne, you've made a really strong case and you've presented a path forward, very encouraging and logical, practical. What final words do you have?
You know, the final word really is to sum up what I've said. And so let me review really quickly what I told you. There's a lack of alignment between these different difficult behavioral changes and their impacts. And so people actually don't make the changes they think they ought to make because there's just no alignment there. Delayed responses, individual behaviors don't impact it. Secondly, it's a shared atmosphere, but separate national sources of climate emissions, and treaties haven't solved it. And above all, this is really important takeaway, this is a China-India coal problem. That's what it is. Thirdly, the mandate subsidy policy responses have been ineffective, and they're extraordinarily expensive. So why would you continue something which is expensive and ineffective? Renewables are unlikely to replace fossil fuels in a meaningful way without new technology. I think fossil fuels just are too much energy density, too many advantages, and renewables don't have enough going for them to overcome that. So you can subsidize them and you can build them, but people aren't going to give up their fossil fuels yet. But there is a viable way out of this dilemma. And just to repeat what I just said, natural gas displaces coal, nuclear power builds out, technology improves, conservation's taken seriously, and we adapt as a society. And if we do that, I think we can look each other in the face, say that we're honestly addressing the issue. We're not doing a pie in the sky type of scenario. We're not talking about a net zero, which is likely not obtainable. We're dealing in the real world. And I think we can impact CO2 emissions if we do that.
Well, Claiborne, thank you so much. This was very insightful. I really appreciate you taking time to do this.
Thanks, Matt. I've enjoyed it, and it's always fun to converse and talk with someone who's equally understands the issues.
If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.